Welcome to Nurses and Midwives Talk with Ruth Oshikanlu, celebrating nurses and midwives in 2020, the year of the nurse and the midwife. Welcome to another episode of Nurses and Midwives Talk with Ruth Oshikanlu, celebrating nurses and midwives in 2020, the year of the nurse and the midwife. We've got a distinguished guest with us today, Professor Laura Saran, OBE. Laura is a multi-award winning nurse academic, global diversity and inclusive practice specialist, professional speaker, and an experienced coach. Laura has over 30 years experience of healthcare practice, research, policy development, and strategic leadership, including working with a range of national and international government agencies. In 2014, Laura was identified in the top 50 leaders in the UK by the Health Services Journal in 3 separate categories. In 2018, she was awarded an OBE for services to nursing and health policy. And she was also named as the 8th most influential Black person in Britain by the Power List 2018. The awards go on and on and on. I've just shortened it. Thank you so much, Laura, for giving up your time. I'm sure you're really busy, but thank you for honoring the invitation.
I've always got time for you, Ruth.
Oh, thank you so much. So let's start. I'm so curious. I know a lot of you about your journey, but I want the audience to really know how you got to where you are now, with the view to inspiring them. Because what I love about your story is it tells me you can be anything you want to be. So how did you get into nursing and up to where you are now, a professor, an OBE, and power, named in Power List? Tell us all.
Well, I have to say, Ruth, to yourself and to anybody listening, that there was no grand plan. I didn't have it all mapped out. It wasn't something that I thought about. In fact, those of you who know me, and I know you know yourself, is originally I'd always wanted to do medicine. I'd always wanted to be a doctor. I particularly wanted to be a GP, mainly because I was like many other people. While I was born in the UK, I came from parents who came from the Caribbean, from a very small island called Dominica, very beautiful island. And we lived in relative poverty. I have to say, when I say that I only know it to be relative poverty now as an adult. I never felt poor at any point in my childhood. And I think that's probably a reflection of the fact that everybody around me had the same thing. So, it wasn't that we lived in an affluent area and other children had less than we had. We all had the same. I was born in the 1960s, and so we were very much living in the back-to-back terraces in Nottingham at the time. In areas that in the early 70s were cleared as part of the National Slum Clearance. And we were moved on to the large council estates that grew up all over. So there was nothing, I suppose, unusual in that about my upbringing, very typical of many first generation children of migrants. I always was very interested in education. I read very early. I think my mother told me that by the age of 4 I could read, and I think that's how they kept me quiet. I was always an avid speaker, always questioning, probably too many questions, and I haven't really changed, I think, probably from that. But one of the things that I did become aware of as I got older was that, there was a difference in what people had and didn't have. And particularly in terms of health. So some of the people that I saw around in my community, and I lived in a very multicultural community, we had a large Irish population in where I lived. There were Caribbean families from various islands, etc. Very migrants from lots of different places, and some very working class, hard-working British UK people as well. But, you know, there were people who were relatively young who were ill from different conditions, which as I grew up, I realized that that wasn't usual. And so and when we did have to go to the doctor, or if there was a trip to the doctor, there was always a long wait. The waiting rooms were always full, etc. So I was really interested into why people didn't have the same health chance. That's what drove me. I was very good at school. I enjoyed school. I did A levels. I did GCSE, well, O levels. I'm trying to make myself look younger by saying GCSEs now, but everybody knows it was O levels when I was younger. And I applied for medical school. I had an interview, and I went to the interview. And while I was actually at the interview, and this was at medical school in London, I remember thinking, as the time went on, I don't think this is for me. And mainly because the message that I got at the time, and this was 1981 when I was going for these interviews, the messages I got at the time was, if you do really well as a student, if you're really, you know, really one of the high flyers, you will become a consultant very quickly. And actually, then you can get to do all the interesting stuff. And it appeared to me that it was all about getting further away from the patients. I'm not saying that that was the message, but that's certainly what I took from it. At the time as well, there were not many people from comprehensive poor backgrounds that I knew that went to medical school. And there was a particular point when I was not at the interview, waiting to be interviewed, where I was sitting with some medical students who were showing us around. And they asked me, you know, which school I went to. And I told them. And they were all a bit puzzled. They're going, well, which school is that? We've never heard of this school. And I said, oh, it's a comprehensive school. And you could have heard a pin drop. Practically everyone looked at me, and one of the students went, she goes to a comprehensive. And everybody looked at me, and I thought, these are not my people. and I suppose I could have just stayed there, but I went in and thinking, this isn't really what I feel like I want to do. It doesn't really speak to what I want to do. I want to make sure that people have an equal chance of health in a community sense. And so I got back, I went for my interview, I went into the panel, and, you know, on the panel, I just said, I've changed my mind.
You didn't go through with the interview. You changed your mind already.
The interview, and they asked me a few questions, and then I just said, I just need to say I've changed my mind. And I think they were a bit shocked, and I left the room and got on the train to go back on my own, because my parents had left school, before the age of 15. They had, no one in my family had been to university. So there was no sense of, driving me down to my interviews or anything. I literally went on the train, found my way there, and went into the interview. And I came back on the train, and all I could worry about was, how was I going to tell my parents I wasn't going to do medicine anymore? And what was I going to be doing? And when I came home and I told them, I think my mother took a touch of the vapors, they were like, oh, what? Because all I'd ever talked about for years, and remember, I'm now coming up to 18, was wanting to do medicine. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to go to university. And when I went back to school, and I was doing A levels, science A levels. And when I went back to school, one of my teachers said to me, well, you do realize that you can go to university and do nursing. And I was like, oh, I didn't know that. And then, so I looked into it, and found that they just started in some of the older polytechnics and some universities doing degrees in nursing. And the rest, as they say, is history in terms of training. So I did a 4-year degree program at Sheffield City Polytechnic, as it was then, to get my registered general nurse, RGN qualification. So there was only a group of about 30 of us in the class altogether, and I did that training over 4 years, which of course always makes me laugh now when people say degree nurses are new, and I'm thinking, well, I qualified in 1986. That's how, and there were ones before me. So this is not a new thing. So that's where, and then in working in that, I then, when I qualified, I worked on gynecology. And I was really, really interested in gynecology initially because I wanted to be a midwife. Initially because I thought, oh, midwifery would be really good. I'll be able to work in the community, help people. I'd learned by then the importance of having a good start in life, and how that really had a massive impact on your health and your life chances as you go through life. And you, as a midwife and health visitor, Ruth, I know that you know that really well. But in the 80s, you had to do either an obstetric course, or you had to do your adult nurse training, or you could apply for midwifery. There was no direct entry. So I did, I qualified, and I went to work on gynecology while I waited to apply for midwifery. And I loved it. I loved gynecology. And I never did midwifery. I stayed in gynecology, and I went, within a couple of years of me qualifying, of course, and this was 1986, we hit the first major wave of the AIDS pandemic in the UK. And one of the things I really liked about the work that I did there in gynecology was actually trying to understand the social context in which many of the women that I cared for lived, and how that impacted on their sexual and reproductive health. You know, whether they could access fertility services, whether they were able to control and monitor their own fertility around not getting pregnant, or being able to access services to support fertility, their access to a range of reproductive services, from abortion to sexual health, etc. And obviously that came in then to working around HIV and AIDS and working with people in various communities. And so I then took on a job as one of the first posts that was co-funded by the local community health as well as local authority. And I worked as a nurse outreach worker in a place called the Health Shop, which we would now call a one-stop shop, but there wasn't really any things like that at the time. And that led me into a whole fabulous world of understanding how sexual and reproductive health really, really impacts on not just your identity, but how people see you in society and your health chances. And I had the privilege of working with people from the London Lighthouse, working with people locally in drop-in centres, working with Drug Dependence Anonymous, working with the buddying system, and a whole range of voluntary agencies around HIV and AIDS support. And that's what led me my interest into sexual health and reproductive health, which is what I did my PhD in. And my PhD looked at the ways in which one aspect of identity, which happened to be ethnicity and gender, and intersected with gender and affected health chances. So I looked at the sexual health of Black Caribbean men, and how, because, you know, this is my community, these are my brothers, these are my children, my families, my friends, and the poorer outcomes that were happening really hit home personally as well as professionally. And then from there, Ruth, I was then asked to be part of the group looking at putting together the first policy around sexual and reproductive health and HIV and AIDS, which was started way back in 2000. And that led me, that's how I got into working on policy and policy documents. And I've worked on various policy documents, both here in the UK as well as overseas since then. And that's kind of how I got into it. It's very interesting how I got into education.
Yes, I wanted to ask that. Yeah,
completely by accident. Completely by accident. It wasn't something I intended to do. What had happened was a friend of mine. I was I'd got my two of my children by then, and I was working in practice full time. And one of my friends who worked part-time at a local college in the evening teaching health education on the old BTEC health and social care program, skiing, and broke her leg skiing. And when she came back, she asked me if I could cover a couple of her evening classes in the short term while she was in plaster. And I said, yeah, no, I don't mind doing that. So my first experience of teaching was teaching a class on health and safety at work, and self-help and first aid at work to a group of ex-miners in Shirecliffe, which was an ex-mining village in Derbyshire, which is on the Derbyshire-Nottinghamshire border. So that was how I got into education. And again, I just really enjoyed it. So I carried on working part-time then in education and part-time in practice, and did that for quite a few years, until, and finally moving to working full-time in further education first, and then decided that I wanted to do a PhD. I was still bothered, it's probably one way, I was still bothered about many of the things that I'd seen when I was working as a nurse outreach worker around HIV and AIDS. And the fact that a lot of the things that I knew to be true from my own personal experience and from my professional experience, there didn't seem to be a lot of evidence around it. So that there weren't things written down. And so in the end, I thought, well, if nobody's going to write it, maybe I have to write it. So that's what led me. So I applied to do a PhD at University of Nottingham. And in the time when I was waiting to start my PhD, a job was advertised for a lecturer in adult health at the university, and I applied for it and got it. And that's how I ended up getting into university. So there was no major plan. And over many years since then, I've been involved in various policy work, various development work. I got involved with the, had about 18 months altogether working seconded to the National Nursing Directorate, and I worked around the review of evidence in practice, compassion in practice strategy, which was the last nursing strategy following the Francis report, and so on and so forth. And have always been, at least nearly almost 10 years coming up now, part of the Chief Nursing Officer for England's Strategic Advisory Group, and eventually became the chair. And I kind of think that's probably where I got the OB from, to be honest. It's a bit strange, you having an MB yourself, it's a bit strange when a letter comes saying, you know, you're being not put forward for an OB, and you kind of look at it and think,
what is this?
You know, and I have to tell you a bit, it won't be much of a secret now, but I have to tell you, when the letter came, I thought it was a hoax. And, you know, I didn't actually, you're supposed to respond, and I didn't respond, and then got a message going, oh, you're going to respond? And I was like, oh no, that's a real thing. So yes, so but it was a wonderful day. Wonderful day.
I know, it is. You know what, I'm going to take you right back. So where you are now, when you go back to when you left that room thinking, oh, I don't want to be a doctor anymore, do you feel you made the right choice?
I had no idea. I had no idea. What I knew, though, that it didn't feel right. And one of the things that I learned very early from my parents, and certainly from my mother. I came from a very strong line of women. One of the things I learned was trust your gut feelings. That if it doesn't feel right, it isn't right. And I just knew that it wasn't me.
I get you.
I felt like I was in the wrong purpose, if that makes sense. And actually, it was strange, because I remember as I went to leave the room, the last thing that the chair said to me was, when you leave this room, young lady, just remember you could have been a doctor. Well, you're now a professor. And I didn't know what else I was going to do. And remember, I just thought, well, this is just not what I'm supposed to do. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, but I knew that wasn't it.
It totally resonates, because I'm of Nigerian descent, and I'm the first, so we don't have an NHS. So your parents steer you, and it's always good to have a doctor in the family. That means you get free healthcare for life, you know. So when I told my parents I was no longer going to continue with my medicine studies, they were so upset. And then I told them I'm going to be a nurse. Well, looking back, I could see how the difference you've made. You talk about gynae, your eyes lit up, and the impact you've had in the nursing profession, in education. For 30 years you've been doing this, honing your craft. And this is where, because of that impact and the difference you've made, all these awards just come. We never set out to do these things, but being purposeful, living with purpose, being on purpose, that's what gets us here. So I'm so glad you chose to be a nurse, because I may not have. I've got to meet you and work closely with you. One of the
things that I find that actually I find quite strange when you work in nursing field across in other countries, is you recognize, I mean, certainly within the Caribbean, I would say that nursing is a very respected profession. And actually people use the title nurse in the way that you'd use the title doctor. So people would call you nurse so-and-so in the street, you know, going about your normal business. And so I was fortunate that actually the profession itself is so well respected, I suppose, in that way. But you're right. You don't know what it is that drives you to make the decisions that you make, but you just kind of go with them because it's like a compulsion, I suppose. Like,
and then I suppose going back to the gut, it does feel right. And you think, okay, why not? Give it a
yes.
go. And then you realize, oh, for this I was made.
Well, that's it. Yes. But I suppose if people had told you at the beginning where you would be now, you wouldn't have believed it anyway.
That's true. As Steve Jobs, if you watch one of his interviews he did, it's a TED Talk. He says the dots never connect going forward, but you look back and then you can join them all up. Yeah, great stuff.
Yes. Well, I just reminded me, not Steve Jobs, but you know, one of my very good friends now, who is actually my coach, Neslin, and what Neslin says, when the student is ready, the teacher appears.
Most definitely. When we need to learn those lessons, you know,
yes.
they emerge. The teacher emerges.
Yes.
Excellent. What do you love about your role, being a nurse?
I think the thing that I like the most is actually the opportunity to give people a chance of good health, equal health, a good equal chance, I suppose, is the way I would put it. And particularly for me, working with student nurses and young nurses, it's that sense that hopefully somehow by my work, my support, my agency, or just creating that environment in which they can learn, that we have a very good future in relation to the profession, that we inspire them to not only do good work or do good nursing work, but also to understand, recognize and appreciate how the different contexts in which people live every day affect their health and life chances. So in a little way, I feel like my contribution is kind of changing the world, but one life chance at a time.
Most definitely. And you do, students, you just feel like you're growing the next generation, you're passing the baton on. So that journey continues through them. And I'm sure you must look back, those you contributed to their growth and development, when you see them achieve, you just beam with pride that,
yes, that is fabulous. I mean, it starts with me from graduation. I love graduation. I absolutely love it. I mean, I know it sometimes may seem like hard work, when there's hundreds of students and you're clapping to it, people, but every single one of them, I feel it's almost like I'm, not so much I've given birth to them, but also like I'm, they've grown not directly or indirectly, if you like, under my wing, and they are, I'm proud of what they've achieved. And if I think about what I had to do in my training, back in 1986, 82 to 86, I trained. These nurses now, the student nurses, have to do infinitely more than I ever had to do. And actually, the world within which they come to work is so much more complex. It's much less certain. We're now, in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. They are dealing with things. They are doing tasks and procedures which, when I trained, were extended roles done by qualified nurses who'd been on the wards, 5 years. So I absolutely take my hat off to them, and I will defend them. I will defend the fact that they are as dedicated, as committed, as able, and as competent as anybody else who wherever they trained. I absolutely will defend that, defend that to my last breath.
Great stuff. Your achievement list is so long, and I don't want to assume that these are the greatest achievements. I want to hear from you. What have been your greatest accomplishments?
There's two things I would say. I definitely would say seeing my students thrive. I mean, there are some, I mean, I don't want you, whenever you start naming someone, you miss somebody else out, but there are some of my students that I remember interviewing, and they are now fabulous nurse leaders and healthcare leaders in their own right. And I think, and that makes me absolutely proud. The second thing that I think is my proudest moment was getting the OBE. I do have to say that. You know, my parents left the Caribbean. They came, you know, across just like many of us did at the time of the Windrush era. They came in that package of time where people traveled to help. And they'd left school early, they themselves, and they sacrificed so that we could have education and do what we needed to do. And I felt when I got the OBE, it wasn't so much for me, but it was actually, you know, a recognition of their contribution and recognition of their hard work and recognition of all the Black, minority ethnic nurses, healthcare people, midwives, women, men who deserved to be recognized and didn't have the opportunity, or it wasn't their right time. So they were the two things that I would say are the most the proudest parts of my professional career. Obviously, I have to say my children, in my personal, but, you know, professionally, they are the two things.
Laura, it totally resonates because I feel like I'm a product of everyone. Everyone's invested in me. So when I get anything, you know, it goes to all of them. It's the little
Yes.
things that made a difference to grow me.
Yes.
So I felt like I was getting it for all of them. And you know what? If I can, so can you. So it's inspiration. And just by reading and just following your journey, I've known you for a few years. It's like, oh, wow, good. You know, you almost, whenever you get something, it feels like you're getting it for all of us. So we're like,
I mean, I'm sure you have a similar phrase in Nigeria. We have a phrase in Dominica, which is like, if one did it, we all did it.
Yes, we all did it. We all did it. My dad said it. Most definitely.
One of us did it.
Yes, most definitely. Oh, great. This year is the year of the nurse and midwife. But COVID got in the way. We're in the middle of a pandemic. What have been some of your challenges and how you responded to them?
I think during this period, it has been very challenging. As you say, we had many things planned for this year of the nurse and midwife. I was very fortunate in 2017 to be part of the ICN program, which was about global policy nurse leadership, and met many nurse leaders from across the globe, really, who are still really good friends, and we still connected. And we have many plans for this year. And you know, the things that we've seen over the last few years in nursing, and nursing taking its place as a global profession, and recognizing that if we are to achieve globally an equal chance of good health, that cannot be done without nurses. And when I heard Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, say that, and he appointed the first chief nurse to the WHO, Elizabeth Ero, that was really, really a proud moment. And then along came COVID, which kind of spoiled a lot of the celebrations. But I think for me, as a public, in a public health and community nurse background, that actually what COVID has done is actually spoken to or reminded us of a lot of the things that I've worked with and for and against over the last 35 plus years. And that is that, you know, a pandemic, a virus just shines a light on the inequalities and the discrimination and the lack of equal chance that exists within our society on many flaws. So, you know, I wrote a article which was in my LinkedIn, and which you may have seen, which is about coronavirus and the challenge of maintaining equality or inclusive practice in that environment. You know, the unequal impact on Black and minority ethnic care workers, the unequal impact on the community. I know in one of your earlier interviews that you had, you know, a very good friend, Francis Fernando, on there too, and the devastation impact on the Filipino communities cannot be underestimated. But similarly, some of the African countries have been equally hit by this. So coronavirus in itself has been a big challenge in terms of service, support and provision. but it's also been a reminder for us about what happens to our society when we do not care for and look to the needs of the marginalized, the seldom heard, the silenced members of our population. Just like a family, we are only as good as the health of the poorest.
Mhm.
And I think that has made us think about a lot more what we're doing. So the challenge for me in this time has been twofold. On the one hand, supporting the students who have risen to the call to, go into practice, to be deployed earlier than they expected, to help the efforts. And on the other hand, working with, as part of the Chief Nursing Officer Strategic Advisory Group, so we held a range of webinars and listening events over a very short 2-week period, chaired admirably by the interim chair, Felicia Kwaku. And we heard from over 1,500 people, 1,500 BME staff, their managers and supporters and friends working in nursing and midwifery and in care around the challenges they were facing, and supporting them to be signposted to the right information, supporting individuals to raise concerns where there were concerns, and challenging and working with the CNO to challenge the need for less discrimination, for anti-racist practice within healthcare and nursing, and for the physical or practical answers to PPE, to managing people, to helping people who are sick to get the support that they need, and to signposting care workers to the best advice and practice. So that's what we've been doing. But in between, like this and like people like yourselves, it's been about celebrating the science and the art of our profession. That we are the profession that are central to COVID. We are the profession that historically has been central to many pandemics, or plagues as they were called before.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a place and a role to play here. This is our time to stand up. Maybe the party's just deferred, it's not cancelled.
It's definitely not cancelled. And COVID has definitely highlighted the difference we as nurses, we're not the only ones, with our allied health professionals, with doctors, with the wider team, the difference nurses make. And yes, it's not the way we would want to celebrate, but people have given us respect that we probably didn't have before, because we've had to rise to the challenge and do that spontaneously. Sometimes there was no time to plan, we just had to respond.
Yeah.
And for me, that in itself is a celebration,
Yeah.
because if it wasn't for nurses and doctors and other health and social care staff, more people would have died. So
this is our time.
Most definitely. Even COVID couldn't get us
We have to
down.
claim it, we have to grasp it. This is our time.
Most definitely. So, how do you plan to celebrate the rest of the year then? Since it's our time, we're only 6 months in.
That might be a nice thing to do. I think it's really about taking opportunities to speak positively about nursing, to actually remind people of the breadth of the career, to remind people of the breadth of the opportunities. I know I've traveled the world. I've been places that I wouldn't even have dreamt of without this profession. At no point have I regretted the decisions that I've made. And I think that, how I will celebrate is by hopefully seeing another group of students through. That's part of a celebration for me. But I think just taking time like this to talk, taking time to connect with other nurses, and preparing myself for when, the restrictions are lifted and we can party.
And we will party hard because we've worked hard to earn it. Great stuff, Laura. I wanted to finish with some words of inspiration to anyone watching this, to other nurses, other midwives, or to attract people to the profession. We know we need so many nurses and midwives. So what would you say to anyone watching?
I think what I would say to all nurses, midwives, and AHPs and care staff out there is, this is our time. We are a proud profession. We have science, we have art, and we have heart at the center of what we do. And all of us have a part to play in this. All of us, somewhere, a person, an individual, a family, a community, or even sometimes a country are relying on us. And they need to know that we're there, but we are a proud profession. Do not forget that we come and we are part of a big kaleidoscope global family of nurses, of midwives, of care staff. We're like roaches.
I know, we're everywhere.
Just one of us, but there's many more behind us. But be proud. And for any aspirant nurses, anybody who's thinking about doing nursing or midwifery or one of the other allied health professions, just take a leap and go. You have no idea how far this can take you.
Oh God, it's far-reaching, most definitely. Thank you so much, Laura, for sharing your journey. You know, the hashtag for this series is not just the nurse, and you have shown by your journey, your career choices, the impact you're making, the contribution you're making to the profession, growing other nurses, shaping them, that you are not just a nurse. Professor Laura Serran, OBE, all of them, and thank you. Thanks for your
Thank you for
time.
your time, and everybody just stay safe.
Yes. And as you heard, keep well, stay safe. Thanks for joining us in this episode. See you on the next one. Thank you for listening to Nurses and Midwives Talk with Ruth Oshikanlu. See you on the next episode. Until then, take care.